Amen. Well, I received this beautiful mailing from the presiding bishop in the Episcopal Church, and it's got a labyrinth. Isn't that kind of nice? Striking graphic, and it has the 4 Sundays of Advent with messages for each Sunday. Last Sunday was telling the truth. Unfortunately, I got this later, so I didn't do it. Well, anyway. Today, it's proclaiming the dream. And next Sunday, Advent 3, will be repairing the breach and finally practicing the way. So it is sort of a journey, a set of steps, a set of practices we can take in order to become, preparing to become the beloved community. That's a wonderful, evocative phrase that's often associated with Martin Luther King, although he borrowed it. Forget the name of the African-American theologian, Thurman, I believe, Howard Thurman, talked about this beloved community that we can become, that Christ is calling us to become, that the Holy Scriptures picture as becoming. We heard from 1 Peter this idea that we're waiting. A day in the Lord is like 1,000 years. We don't know how long it will be. Only the Father, said Jesus last week. But when that day comes, we'll know it. And that day will inaugurate this place where righteousness and peace have kissed, as it says in our psalm in a beautiful image. Mercy and truth have come together. Where we all, wherever we have come from on our journey toward God, wherever our past, whatever our culture, our ethnicity, our race, whatever breaks us apart in this world and divides us right now, will be overcome. The breach will be repaired. The healing and the reconciliation work that is necessary will be done. And we will become that dream of God, the beloved community. We're on a long way to go there, but we're preparing the way, says the presiding bishop. Help your people prepare the way. So taking that to heart and taking also in mind that this Advent I want to tell stories. So last week I told the story of a Navajo woman modeled after Ruth. And part of that was made up, but part of that was true. The story of how the Navajo had been forced off their land in a long march until, by a government that didn't care, and by settlers that wanted their land. Part of our story as a people. Part of the better angels of our nature I talked about the week before that on last Pentecost, Christ the King, when I spoke about the prophet Samuel telling the people of Israel, if you want a king, you better watch out, because a king will end up becoming a tyrant and making you slaves. But yet the people engaged in this social contract in the ancient world. And the people who put the social contract together for our country back in the 18th century, as they debated the Constitution, knew about that experience of the Israelites. They knew about the experience of Greece and Rome and Western culture and civilization, and its history of kings and conflict and war, and said, let's put together a country that doesn't have a single tyrant, that has checks and balances. So for a couple of weeks I find myself speaking about our beloved country and how we might become the beloved community, how we can draw from all of our different strands and celebrate our heritage so that we might then come together instead of divide. It's the second Sunday of the month, and I often use these second Sundays to talk to the confirmands. So we have a number of people who will be coming into a confirmation class. You look around for teenagers. They're hard to find. But, I've got one behind me. And I realize as I talk to young people, so often we assume a kind of knowledge. In fact, we ourselves may or may not know so many things. When you read these surveys about people, what do they know? So I thought I'd talk about two people that Many of us will know, but perhaps some won't. Two Americans who tell a particular story. And one was born, well, he said his birthday was July 4th, 1900. Turn of the century, turn of the 20th century. Sort of a new Independence Day. But he really didn't know his birthday, since he was the son of a prostitute and a missing father, raised in a difficult and harsh neighborhood in New Orleans called Storyville. At a very early age, he had to go work, age 5 or 6, and deliver coal for people and do other errands. He ended up working for a very nice family, though, the Karnofskys. Murray Karnofsky, Lithuanian Jewish family, had come as part of that wave of immigrants into America around the turn of the century, and he recognized this young boy as a good soul, and he kind of took him into the family a little bit. They celebrated Thanksgiving together. He made them kind of part. And in fact, this young man ended up the rest of his life wearing a Star of David on a necklace around his neck. He was a sunny personality with a great gift for music, and Morris Karnofsky recognized that, and around the age of 10 or so, he bought him a little cornet and gave it to him to practice. So he started playing on the streets. He only got to age 11 in school, but started playing on the streets for money and became very good at this new kind of music that was burgeoning up in New Orleans. You know, there was a ragtime, had introduced a syncopation, and then the brass bands that accompany the funerals in New Orleans, the brass martial music and the instruments from Europe had been taken with this African drumming and syncopation and become a wonderful blend that became known as Dixie music, jazz. And this young man was part of that stew and became one of the great figures in that. He left to Chicago after learning a little bit with Kid Ory and ended up with King Oliver up there and started his own little group called the Hot Five. You may remember Louis Armstrong. Now, did everybody know Louis Armstrong? Not everybody may know who Louis Armstrong was, because he was a dominant cultural figure, though, even when I was growing up. Now, he was born in 1901, actually, August, but he lived until 1971, and throughout that long career in all those different times, he was an ambassador for racial reconciliation. He always crossed that. He was the first, really, what do they call that, when you cross those lines and become a hit in different genres across that racial conflict that's so embedded in the 1920s and 30s, as you can imagine, how fiercely segregated, how hard it was. In fact, they made a movie and featured Louis Armstrong and some of the early jazz people, but they cut out his songs because it made it look like jazz was a black invention, not a white one. Well, of course it's a black invention, and although Bix Beiderbecke and some others made key involvement early on, it was this African-American music that was the gift to the world. It started sweeping across Europe and became this amazing thing. But that Lithuanian Jew that helped him, well, there was a lot of Jews also involved in those 20s and 30s, people like Irving Berlin and George Gershwin, who came also from Russia as Jews, living an immigrant life. Both of them were raised in the tenement streets of New York. Neither of them got it much past 3rd or 4th grade. Both of them ended up writing songs and becoming hit writers for Tin Pan Alley and writing songs. Gershwin, for instance, wrote this amazing. He knew he wanted to learn European music too, and he went to Paris, and he applied to study to Maurice Ravel and Nadine Boulanger, these famous teachers of classical music. And Ravel said to him, "I won't take you as a student. That would make you a second-class Ravel, but you're a first-class Gershwin." He wrote American in Paris over there while he was there. Came back and wrote an opera called Porgy and Bess, which took this African-American music and story and made it into an opera, out of which some of the songs, such as Summertime, came out, that Louis Armstrong had a big hit with. This wonderful mix of immigrant, formerly enslaved cultures made American music, and those same Jewish immigrants who came over in that turn of the century, who ended up starting the young movie business, who ended up going out to Hollywood, Mayer and the Warner Brothers, and became a cultural force. So Louis Armstrong is one name I want to our young people to know. They may know that one because he was a force right up until his death in 1971. He was living by that time in New York City, and you can go visit his grave. It's right in Flushing, Queens. The other person is a woman. She was born 14, 15 years later in either Philadelphia or Baltimore. The story changes, but she says the story, she told the story in her autobiography. She says, I was born in Baltimore. My father was 18, my mother was 16, and I was 3. So very young parents. Very young parents who didn't know how to raise a child, and the father left off to pursue his dream of becoming a musician. The mother, she really had trouble. Oftentimes the child had to be left with her mother or other relatives while she pursued work in different far-flung places. The child did not receive a good education and also dropped out of school and got in trouble. She was really formally educated only up till 11. She finally joined her mother up in Harlem, New York City, when she was 14. Her mother had landed there, but ended up landing in a brothel and becoming a prostitute, and as did her daughter after she came. So you can imagine, 14 years old, uneducated, working as a prostitute in New York City in 1930. This is not a good future. But yet she had something in her that wanted more. And so she'd go out and sing in these different nightclubs. And one day there was a woman singer who couldn't make it because she was sick, so she took her spot. And in that audience that day was the record producer John Hammond. Early in his career, he'd go on to discover so many others, all the way to Bob Dylan. But he was in the audience that day and spotted the young Billie Holiday. And said she had something special. Not only this good and distinctive voice, but a way of changing the tempo of the melody to suit the emotion. And there was something just so distinctive about her that he signed her to a contract, and the next year she recorded, and she was off to become one of the biggest stars of the musical world. She recorded in those 1930s a number of big hits. She wrote a song, actually, she sang a song called Strange Fruit that was written by a Jewish school teacher in New York City as he read about the history of blacks being lynched in the South and that strange fruit hanging on the tree of the lynching tree, what my systematic professor James Cone called the cross and the lynching tree, one and the same. Powerful indictment of the brutality of segregation and Jim Crow, keeping African Americans in their place through violence. She sang this powerful song. It didn't sell a lot at first, but it became a big hit and became a powerful message. It spread. Her fame in Europe was overwhelming. While she continued to struggle with men who abused her and alcohol and drugs, she had difficult times in her life, and in one case was imprisoned, but she got out in 1956 and wrote an autobiography, recorded some songs, and had a concert in Carnegie Hall. You can look it up now. It's a wonderful world. You can go to YouTube and say, Billie Holiday, Carnegie Hall, 1957. At that time, her health was already failing. The shadow of her voice was all that was left. They said that in rehearsals, they didn't know if she could really go on. But when she went on, dressed in the white gown with gardenia in her hair, she rose up, she was beautiful, her voice was strong, and it's amazing to witness. A little tear in my eye just thinking about it. Because the emotional depth when she sings these songs, I Lost My Man, the old blues, but also the depth of the suffering of the African American people come through. She died the next year, cirrhosis of the liver and other complications. She's buried at St. Raymond's in the Bronx. You can go there too. Those are two people in the rich cultural history of America who have prepared the way, I want to say, for becoming the beloved community. Think of the power of American music and movies around the world. Think of how important the contribution of blacks and Jews were to this. And anybody who dares say American culture is a purely founded on Western European civilization, is blind as well as bigoted. Because here we have created this melting pot, it's still a good image in my mind, of all of the different peoples who've come from around the world. True, we can't always live together well. True, we have a lot to learn and a long way to go. But these stories, Billie Holiday, Louis Armstrong, surely they are like John the Baptist, a voice that shouts out, a voice crying in the wilderness. Prepare the way. Listen to each other. Love one another. I think that as we live together and love one another, if we could only listen to the music that comes from each other, we'd go a long way to preparing the way for the beloved community, which is coming. For Christ is coming. God is in charge. Strive to hasten that day by being the best Christian